What's going on, everybody? We're back here today with another fantasy football video. Today we're going to go over the week 2 rankings, and I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Last week I did a huge video with all of the rankings in one video. This time I'm going to switch it up into 2 videos, kind of go over the running backs in one video and the wide receivers in another, just so I could talk a little bit more about some more players. But before we get into the video, please do leave a like, comment, subscribe, especially if this video helped you out. So getting into the rankings, we're going to start with running back today in the standard leagues. Starting off with Jonathan Taylor, the #1 running back in my opinion this week. Had a monster game last week against the Texans. Unfortunately, he did lose, but this week he faces the Jacksonville Jaguars, who basically let, I forgot who it was, they faced the Commanders. Antonio Gibson run all over them this week. Jonathan Taylor is much better running back than Antonio Gibson, and he's going to be a key part of the offense, so I expect Jonathan Taylor to be heavily featured. And most likely the #1 back this week. Christian McCaffrey, I could see competing against him this week, although he was very disappointing in his week 1 debut. Well, not debut. His week 1 season opener against the Cleveland Browns in Baker's debut. The Panthers just really got nothing going offensively in the first half. And it wasn't even until, I think, the second half that McCaffrey scored his touchdown. I think he had 5 touches in the first half in total, which is just, it can't fly. Baker's going to have to get McCaffrey more involved in the offense earlier on in the game, especially if they want to win games. So I have McCaffrey pretty high up on the list. In PPR, I believe I may have him #1. Let's take a look. Yeah, in PPR formats, I do have him #1, but in standard formats, I have Jonathan Taylor above him. #3, I have Dalvin Cook going against the Philly defense, who just let Deandre Swift and Jamal Williams score a couple touchdowns on them last week. Dalvin Cook's the mainstay of that offense, him and Justin Jefferson. As they go, the Vikings go. And last week, Dalvin Cook did have a solid performance, but when Justin Jefferson is cooking like that, it's really hard to get away from him, so it kind of hindered Dalvin Cook's numbers. Last week, he only scored 10 fantasy points in standard leagues. I definitely expect him to go a little bit higher, maybe even sneak in for a touchdown this week. Austin Eckler, on the other hand, was really disappointing. 7 points from your first-round pick, and a guy that's expected to be a huge part of the Chargers offense. He just did not get many targets, didn't even get many rushes. But the big thing is Keenan Allen did go down with an injury, and him being their #1 receptions guy, it opens up a lot of targets for other players. Austin Eckler mainly, Mike Williams as well. Some of their other younger wide receivers could also step up. But I expect Eckler to get a little bit more carries this game, a little bit more receptions this game. So overall, expect a bigger game from Eckler. Last week, I had him as my #1 running back overall, just because I like the matchup, but it ended up not working out. Derrick Henry last week had a solid game against the Giants. But he really only got 82 yards, so it's not Derrick Henry-esque that we're used to. We're used to seeing 120 yards, a touchdown, 2 touchdowns. But he really had a solid game, just only 82 yards, unfortunately. The Giants' defense was improved, and now he faces a tough Buffalo defense. That front line for Buffalo is pretty good, and I would have him a little bit higher on the list if he were facing a softer defense. Nick Chubb last week had a game, 143 yards, ran all over the Panthers, and this week he faces the Jets. And the Jets, although they did contain the Baltimore running backs last week, Nick Chubb is a whole different kind of animal, and the Cleveland Browns are going to use their dynamic backfield, Chubb and Hunt, as much as they can. So I expect Chubb to have a lot of carries, especially with Brissett under center. Saquon went off last week. It's like a little revenge tour for him this year. He had a pretty disappointing season last year, and I'm pretty high on Saquon this year. I think he's going to have that revenge tour comeback season that we all want him to. He was the #1 scoring running back last week in fantasy football, and this week he faces the Carolina Panthers, who just let Chubb run all over them. So I expect a big game from Saquon. He's really the only offensive threat on the Giants. You can say Sterling Shepard, you can say Kadarius Toney, who wasn't even involved last week on the offense. Richie James is a little involved. Galladay sucks, so it's really just all Saquon. Deandre Swift, who had a pretty good game against the Eagles last week, had a huge 50-yard run, which led to a Jamal Williams touchdown. He got his own touchdown in there as well. Deandre Swift is in line for a big year. Him and Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jamal Williams are basically the Lions' offense, and TJ Hawkinson. Let's not forget about him. So the Lions do have some offensive weapons. They're not the greatest defensive team, which may lead them to being down a lot. But DeAndre Swift is a dynamic back. He can catch, he can run, and I expect him to get a huge workload this week as well against the Commanders. Moving on, we have the mainstay of the first round of fantasy football drafts, Joe Mixon. I feel like he's been a first round pick for like the last 5 or 6 years now. He's always there. He's Mr. Consistent. He'll get you those yards. And now he's actually getting more involved in the passing game. T. Higgins got injured last week with the concussion, so he may miss this week. And Joe Mixon lined up a good amount of receptions last week because of that. If Higgins does miss time, Mixon could rack up a couple more receptions and really boost his value this week, especially in PPR leagues. But Mixon's a solid player nonetheless, and he's definitely one of our top 10 running backs this week. And he just played Dallas, who Leonard Fournette just ran all over last week. I think he had 120-ish yards. So moving on to Leonard Fournette, going against the Saints this week, who just let Corduro Patterson run 120 yards on them. So I expect another big game for Fournette. Tom Brady is going to do Tom Brady things, do his game managing stuff. And Leonard Fournette's a great outlet for him, especially with Chris Godwin out. They don't really have someone that could get that short yardage downs. So Leonard Fournette's going to be that check down screen kind of guy for Tom Brady. Javonte Williams had a crazy game last week. More so in PPR formats. I think he had 11 or 12 catches, and that's just huge for the running back. Russell Wilson leaned on him a lot throughout the game, especially near the end of the game where they were trying to mount that comeback. And Javonte Williams, if he can maintain even half of that target share, he's going to be a solid fantasy player this year. He got, I'm not sure how many yards he got exactly. I think 60 or so yards. But those 11 catches just really added to his fantasy total in PPR leagues. Kamara last week and Naji Harris, actually, they both got a little banged up last week. But they're both expected to play again this week. And Kamara faces the Buccaneers D, which might be a tough play for him, especially because last week they didn't let Zeke do anything, Tony Pollard do anything. And that Tampa Bay front line was just too much for Dak. So I can see New Orleans having a lot of trouble this week against the Buccaneers D. Naji Harris, on the other hand, against the New England defense. And that's also problematic because Bill Belichick has a history of taking out your best player in games. So he's probably going to game plan around Naji Harris and kind of make him irrelevant. But Naji Harris is a phenomenal player, so he's still probably going to get his. Aaron Jones goes against Chicago. The Green Bay offense was just terrible last week. A.J. Dillon got the lone touchdown in the game, so Aaron Jones couldn't even score. He didn't get much yardage. He was outplayed by A.J. Dillon overall. But Aaron Jones is their lead back, and A.J. Dillon is more of their change of pace back or back that they use just to give Aaron Jones a little break, or just they play them together too. So both A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones are viable starting running backs in my opinion. But I would give the edge to Aaron Jones just because I expect him to get more of the rushing touchdowns here on out. And both of the backs are really going to have to be involved in the offense and the pass catching just because Aaron Rodgers really has no receivers. I don't think Lazard comes back this week either. Cobb, Dubes, they just couldn't get it done last week. So he's going to lean on his running backs heavily this week. Antonio Gibson versus the Detroit Lions. Gibson had a great game last week, 13 standard fantasy points. Now he goes against the Lions, whose defense isn't amazing, and they let 4 rushing touchdowns from the Eagles last week. I think it was Miles Sanders, Scott, Gainwell got one, and Jalen Hurts got one. So that really bodes well for Antonio Gibson and for touchdowns, really. So I expect Antonio Gibson to have another good game. Rashad Penny, when he plays for Seattle as their lead back, he's a beast. Last season he was on a tear. He did pretty well in his game this week, 6.7 points fantasy-wise. But the game really, I expected Geno Smith to run the ball a lot more than he did. He threw for way more than I thought, and he played well. So I think they kind of assumed everybody would think they would run, so they kind of moved away from it. But in the second half of the game, Seattle really didn't get much going. They eventually ended up winning, so it didn't really matter as much. But I expect Rashad Penny to be a big part of their offense moving forward. Ken Walker, I believe, might be coming back this week. At the time of recording this, I haven't heard anything yet. If he does come back, he may lower Rashad Penny a little bit, especially if they really do split the carries. As of right now, I expect Rashad Penny to see the bulk load of it, and Ken Walker being more of a change of pace kind of guy. Moving on to James Conner, got in for a touchdown last week. The Cardinals were blown out early on in the game, so they moved away from the rushing game, but Conner did still contribute with a good amount of catches, and Conner's a pretty dynamic back himself, so I do expect Kyler Murray to use him as a 3-down back. Unfortunately, if they do fall down again in the score, it might be hard for Conner to get his rushing touchdowns, and he really takes advantage in space. So if Kyler can get him involved early, James Conner should have a good game, especially without DeAndre Hopkins. I think the Cardinals are going to have to be looking for a team kind of makeup for Hopkins aspect, and I think James Conner and Marquise Brown are the first two to step up. Zeke against the Bengals. I'm scared of all Dallas players right now without Dak. CeeDee Lamb, Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard. The only one that I would say maybe can get away with it is Dalton Schultz, because the backup QB did target him quite a bit after he came in. So maybe he also targeted CD a good amount too, but CD didn't catch any of them. So I'm not sure about their chemistry yet. But Zeke, I'm pretty scared about. Whenever Dak is out, they usually flood the line and kind of just stop the run and force Dallas to throw. So it's kind of problematic for Zeke. Yeah, I'm worried about all Dallas players moving forward, at least until maybe Dallas trades for a QB, or at least until Dak comes back. We talked about A.J. Dillon. Josh Jacobs is another player that kind of worries me. He didn't really get much going last week, but then again, they were getting blown out. They had a tough first half, so they kind of stepped away from the run game, and they kind of leaned really heavily on Davante Adams, who had a monster game. So it's understandable that Josh Jacobs had a little bit disappointing of a game. Hopefully he does pick it up this week, but there were talks of him getting less of a workload, kind of splitting it up between different kind of backs. So I'm a little bit wary starting Josh Jacobs. Obviously, if you drafted him, you're going to play him, but just kind of watch out, I guess. Pay attention to the news. He may, I don't know if he'll get overtaken, but the Raiders just might throw a lot more than we assumed this year. Miles Sanders, we spoke about earlier, finally got into the end zone, I think, since 2 years now. He hasn't scored a touchdown. And he's a really, really dynamic running back. I'm not really sure why Philadelphia doesn't use him more often. I feel like 2 years ago, he was one of the best running backs in the league, maybe a top 10 running back. Might be a little bit of a stretch, but he helped a lot of players win fantasy championships, including myself. I picked him up off the wire that year, and he really balled out. So Miles Sanders was that guy, and I guess Philly just doesn't know how to use him next to Hurts, or they just prefer that combined rushing attack. But I think whenever Miles Sanders does good, Philly does good. So I would say they should use him a little bit more often. Corduro Patterson, I have him at 22 against the Rams. Ran for a career high in yards last year. I don't expect that kind of usage every week. They do want to lower his workload. So there's players like Tyler Algier that could come in, grab some carries. But Cordero really takes advantage of his pass catching abilities. And with the Rams front line being as good as they are, there might be a need for a lot of checkdowns going on for Mariota. So Corduro Patterson could have himself a game or get really stuffed by that defensive line. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had a great game last week, scored 19.4 fantasy points in standard leagues. And there was talk about, there was a lot of worry about Hilaire going into the season. They drafted Isaiah Pacheco, who actually also scored a touchdown, the lone rushing touchdown, while Hilaire caught 2 receiving touchdowns. So the Kansas City Chiefs, obviously they have Mahomes, so you know they're going to air it out. They don't have Tyreek anymore, so there was talk of running the ball a little bit more, but no way. With Mahomes on the team, he's going to air it out as much as he can. He put up 5 touchdowns, and it like nothing last week. So I expect Kansas City to really throw the ball more often, which really does hinder Hilaire, unless he can be that pass-catching back like he was this game. Darrell Henderson, I have him ranked above Cam Akers this week. I have Cam Akers like number 43. I'm not playing Cam Akers at all until he kind of works his way back. Earlier in the season, in preseason, I said, stay away from Cam Akers. I don't trust him at all. And I didn't expect it to be this bad. So Darrell Henderson, he performed pretty good, 7.3 fantasy points. And the Rams really struggled that game too. So Darrell Henderson could have a bigger role next week if they're more competitive against the Falcons, which they will be. So I expect Henderson to have a pretty good game. Moving on to Chase Edmonds of the Dolphins against the Ravens. He has a tough defensive matchup this week. Marlon Humphrey's either going to be guarding Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle on the outside. So Tua may have to lean more in his running game with Edmonds and Mostert. I doubt it, though. I feel like Tua's still going to try to get the short yardage with Waddle or Hill and really have them be the playmakers. However, Chase Edmonds is a really good pass-catching back, which will help him in the PPR leagues. And he's not a bad runner, so he could come up with a decent game, but he does play a tough defense, so keep expectations a little bit hindered. David Montgomery had only 5 fantasy points last week, but the Chicago Bears and the 49ers played in like a hurricane, it seemed. Like it was crazy rain. Like the stadium was flooded. They had to shovel the water out. And obviously that's going to affect the running game. It's going to affect the passing game. So I consider that game very fluky. Like I think the Bears threw it maybe like 10 times or completed like 7 passes or something like that. So obviously it's going to be a whole different ball game against the Packers this week. Division rivals, I expect them to bring their A game. So David Montgomery, I expected a little bit of a bounce back from him. Breece Hall in standard leagues was pretty disappointing. He did fumble the ball, and as a rookie, you never want to see that. But in brighter news, they still brought him out after that. Michael Carter did also get a little banged up. He did exit briefly, but came back. And he was also used pretty heavily. He scored 10 points in standard leagues. They were both used a lot in the passing game too, against the Baltimore Ravens. So they couldn't really get anything going off the ground. But as receivers, they both did all right. I think Breece Hall had like 6 catches. Michael Carter had like 7 catches. So in PPR leagues, they're definitely more valuable. And the Jets are really going to focus their offense on Breece Hall, Michael Carter, and Elijah Moore. So I expect to see a lot more of them, especially against this Cleveland defense, which can be tough. So we'll see how that works. Speaking of Cleveland, we have Kareem Hunt. I talked about that dynamic backfield of theirs earlier. If Kareem Hunt gets traded, he's going to be crazy. I'm not really sure where he could get traded to. Let's see. Bills could definitely use him. I think he's better than Singletary. The Rams, I think he's better than Henderson and Akers. 49ers need a running back right now, so that's not a bad pickup for them. But there's no way the Browns trade him. There's no way. So I guess this is a moot point, but let's see. Who else could he play for? Dolphins. Texans, I guess. Falcons, but I think they like Cordero. I think as a player in a full-time role, I think he's also better than Antonio Gibson. Definitely better than Josh Jacobs, in my opinion at least. Obviously, as a fantasy player, he's not better than them this year because he's not in that lead back role. But as a player, I think he's much better. The Broncos have Javonte. No. Seahawks could probably use him as well. I think he's better than Rashad Penny. He's just so dynamic. Like, he's so fast. His pass catching ability is crazy. His rushing ability is amazing. Like, his first few years with Kansas City, he was an animal, like unstoppable. So if he does get traded and he gets that lead back responsibility, he's going to be like a top 10 running back. Maybe even top 5, honestly. Devin Singletary, he wasn't bad. I feel like he got a little outshined by Zach Moss last week, who got more of the pass catching duties. He did score 6.2. Not amazing. Obviously, you want to see a little bit more from one of your backs. But Buffalo is going to air it out a lot. They're a high-powered offense. Then whenever they're throwing a lot, they're going to rely on the run game too, just to throw the defenses off and kind of get that play action going. Damien Harris and Ramandre Stevenson, who I have ranked all the way down here. Damien Harris is definitely the more enticing option of the two. So far, Ramandre was barely used, I think. He got 2.7 points, whilst Harris got 5.8. He's definitely the better option, in my opinion. He's the lead back for New England, and obviously they were getting torched early on by Miami. So they kind of leaned away from the run. The pass game wasn't there for them either. And Mac Jones did get hurt. I think it was back spasms. So he may not play this week. If he doesn't, obviously New England's going to lean on the run even more. James Robinson, I feel like he's never going to go away. He's always just comes out of nowhere. His first season off the waiver wire. His second season, people were waiting to draft him. Then they got Travis Etienne last year. They still didn't get him, and he got hurt, obviously. Now they said Travis Etienne's going to start again, and James Robinson ended up being the guy for them. I actually don't think Travis Etienne started. And when Etienne did play, he fumbled the ball one. He wasn't really that... I think he was really effective as a runner, but that fumble definitely cost him a lot of playing time. And James Robinson scored twice. So that kind of stuff really makes James Robinson so versatile that they just end up playing him so much. Jeff Wilson Jr., I have him here just because of the Elijah Mitchell injury. I'm not sure how San Francisco's going to look. Kittle's still injured. I'm not sure if he'll be back. And he's one of their best run blockers, so they're really going to miss him. Deebo Samuel is going to get a lot of rushing attempts now as well. And I think Elijah Mitchell has been 2 months that he's going to be gone. So he is going to come back just a long time from now. So Jeff Wilson has plenty of opportunity to kind of make that lead back, take advantage of that lead back role for the future. Mike Carter and Travis Etienne, we talked about Jamal Williams as well. Melvin Gordon, he was also pretty involved in the Denver offense. He ran the ball in short yardage, and I feel like they used Javonte Williams more so for early downs and pass catching downs. But when it came down to short yardage and goal line, actually, Melvin Gordon got a couple touches in the goal line, I think more than Javonte Williams. But they both fumbled the ball at the goal line. So that was pretty bad on both of the running backs from Denver. Hopefully against Houston, I expect Javonte Williams to score. Maybe Melvin Gordon can score as well. Kenyan Drake was the lead back for Baltimore this week, but I'm staying away from all Baltimore running backs until J.K. Dobbins comes back. There was talk that he may come back this week, and if he does, J.K. Dobbins will probably be somewhere up here in the rankings if he gets a full workload. If he's limited on snap count, obviously, I'm going to stay away from him this week. But yeah, the Baltimore run game is pretty abysmal without J.K. Dobbins. Rex Burkhead was the lead back for Houston, so that was pretty surprising. I expected Damien Pierce to kind of run away with that job. And I feel like Rex Burkhead, I haven't heard his name in so long. It's pretty cool to see him back in the league, starting nonetheless. So Rex Burkhead's he's a great pass catcher, so definitely Davis Mills can use him for check downs and everything like that. And he's not a bad runner, so pretty cool jump up for Rex Burkhead over here. Khalil Herbert of the Bears got the touchdown, stole it away from David Montgomery. He's more of a handcuff in my opinion, but he will get a good amount of pass catching opportunity with the Bears, so he could sneak in a touchdown or two here and there. Damien Pierce, I have him ranked a little bit lower just because of Rex Burkhead starting. Otherwise, I'd probably have Damien Pierce a little bit higher, maybe in the early 30s instead of the 40s. So he will probably be the better play later on into the season. But for right now, I would kind of have him sit on your bench. Just wait till it's his time. Tony Pollard, they talked him up so much in the preseason. Like, we love him as a receiver. We love him as a runner. And they barely used him as a receiver. He couldn't do anything as a runner. But Tony Pollard is probably the best backup running back in the league, in my opinion, other than Kareem Hunt. But Tony Pollard, especially now with Dak gone, they're going to have to find different ways to get the ball moving. Tony Pollard is probably going to be key in that. But with all that preseason talk of him getting used as a pass catcher, they didn't really use him. They did have him and Elliott on the field at the same time. And I think he did line up at wide receiver, but they didn't really target him. So it's kind of just whatever. I expect Pollard to have a bigger role this week. But again, like I said, I'm kind of avoiding all Dallas players. Hines, he did good in PPR formats. Obviously, with Jonathan Taylor, Hines isn't going to get a load of carries, especially when Taylor gets 30 carries himself. So Hines was pretty decent in the pass catching department. He was obviously more valuable in PPR formats, but he is, in my opinion, one of the most valuable handcuffs. Him and Tony Pollard, I think they're most valuable handcuffs just because they can really do it all, and they're behind such high usage guys in Ezekiel Elliott and Jonathan Taylor. Cam Akers, very disappointed in him. 0 points, put up that donut. But I think I'm done talking about Cam Akers. Ramandra Stevenson, we spoke about a little bit. Raheem Mostert. Funny thing is, they have Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle on the team. And I think Raheem Mostert might be faster than both of them. He has crazy speed, and I like him more than Chase Edmonds. But Chase Edmonds is a little bit more dynamic, more versatile. So I think that's why they went with him as a lead back. And Mostert did have that big injury. But I really like Mostert as a player. I think he's a beast. In San Francisco that year, he was like, I don't know, top 5 running backs one year. I'm not sure. But once we get down here, it's mostly just handcuff territory. Dontrell Hilliard, who stole Derrick Henry's touchdown. Mike Davis, the backup. Alexander Madison is another popular backup for Dalvin Cook. That's all for the standard leagues. I'm not going to go into all of the, the rankings for each of them, but I will talk about why I have some players higher than others. Let's talk about PPR. I feel like PPR and half PPR, the rankings are more so the same. It's somewhere in the middle. But in PPR, I have McCaffrey as my number 1 back, and Saquon I expect to be a lot more involved in the offense in the pass catching department, so I have him really high up. Deandre Swift and Eckler as well, they're both there. Kamara's up here. Derrick Henry and Cook take a little bit of a hit. Aaron Jones as well. Javonte Williams I would have had higher, but the problem is I'm not sure. Like, he really only went off because he got those 11 receptions last game, and there's no guarantee he will get that again. Whereas Fournette, Kamara, Saquon, Eckler, they've proven that they'll get this many carries, many receptions every game. So I have them a little bit higher. James Conner as well gets a big boost. Chubb and Harris take a little bit of a hit. Gibson gets a boost. AJ Dillon, Zeke falls a lot. Hilaire gets a boost. Patterson, Hunt, Jacobs falls. Penny falls. I think James Robinson got a big boost here. Breece Hall and Michael Carter, I have them a little bit higher. Naheem Hines as well. Tony Pollard, I believe, is higher. Burkhead is higher. Cam Akers still down here. Hilaire I have a little bit higher, and Mostert all the way down here. But for the most part, in PPR leagues, I really like McCaffrey's odds this week, Saquon's this week. Well, they're facing each other, so that's kind of ironic. But I think they're going to have really good games. Eckler. There was another player. Clyde Edwards-Hilaire I have a little bit higher. He did get those 2 receiving touchdowns. If they use Pacheco more as like a short down back or a goal line back, Hilaire is going to have to get involved in the passing game to kind of solidify that spot. So I really expect him to he's kind of competing for his job, in my opinion. So I really expect him to play out of his mind this year. Kareem Hunt as well. Obviously, he requested that trade. Like I said, I don't see Cleveland trading him. But if he can really show other teams what he has, maybe they'll give Cleveland an offer that they can't refuse. So Miles Sanders I also have a little bit higher. He's obviously a great pass catcher, but Philly is definitely a run-heavy team. So it'll be a little bit interesting to see how they use Miles Sanders. I really want them to use him more. And I think that's most of the differences. Other than that, I feel like it's more so the same between PPR and half PPR. But let me know what you guys think. If you guys want to see the rankings, go through all the other positions. I have QB, wide receiver, tight end, defense, flex, all over here. I'll leave the link down below in the description. And leave a comment down below. Who do you think is going to be the #1 running back this week? Whether it be McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon, or you got maybe a surprise pick, Naji Harris going off, Joe Mixon going off, Gibson. Who do you think is going to be the #1 running back? Let me know down below, and that should be all for this video. I'll see you guys next time.